Hi everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News, brought to you by Anson Evaluate and produced by Digital Law. So I'm joined today with my colleague Peter, the Managing Director of Digital Law. So just for those who don't know, Digital Law is a niche law firm based in Barnsley in the UK, and we have clients all over the UK and all over the world really, and we specialise in things to do with data protection, cyber law, and things to do with social media law as well. So I'll just pass over to Peter just to introduce himself before we get started with the story.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, so my name is Peter. I'm the solicitor and managing director of Law, and very pleased to be speaking to everyone this week. We've got some really big things to discuss, in particular around Facebook, and then of course also coming back to things like more mundane security concerns, but in particular a few things that we've been talking about on this news updates for probably the last 6 months, and sure enough, some of the data is now proving that we were absolutely right. So I'll pass over to Laura to take us through it.
Thanks, Peter. So his first two stories today are in relation to Facebook. So the first is about Trump and his ban from Facebook. So about 6 months earlier this year, I think it was beginning of this year, Trump was actually banned from Facebook, and I think he was banned initially for around 6 months, and it was all to do with the storming of the Capitol in America, and the Facebook chief executive is understood to have let the former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg actually then decide whether this ban is extended, whether it's delayed, or whether it's completely a complete ban, basically. So instead of making the decisions themselves, they've kind of passed it over to the UK and gave it to Nick Clegg to make this decision. So I'm sure we'll hear something about it within the next couple of weeks or so as to whether Trump will be banned from Facebook forever.
Indeed, thank you, Laura. I mean, it's a very interesting story, this, because Nick Clegg was brought in a couple of years ago by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg to deal with some of the issues around, I think, politics, perception, and wider policy with regards to some of the issues that Facebook was coming into. So he was appointed in 2018, around the time of those Senate hearings that took place, and then the other hearings in parliaments around the world where Facebook was asked to come and give evidence, along with other social media platforms. And there was lots of questions about how it operated and how it's using the data. And they said, look, if you don't like what we're doing, regulate us. Well, here we are several years later, and there hasn't been, apart from the introduction of GDPR, which everyone knew was coming anyway, there hasn't been any specific broader regulation introduced of Facebook, how it handles data or its practices. So in an effort to sort of window dress the situation, we have Nick Clegg, who's set up this Facebook external advisory board. So the idea is this advisory board is independent, and it's been asked to look at some of the more high profile issues that come up on the platform. Now, people will know, if you've ever had a post sort of suspended or investigated by Facebook, it could take a few weeks, and someone comes back and then says, oh, we've had to take it down, and this is the reason why, and very often you can't appeal it, and it's the most cumbersome thing. Well, you can imagine millions of things like that happen every day because there are billions of users on Facebook. Yet when it comes now to this group that Facebook, that Nick Clegg has set up, they've only looked at a few dozen decisions since they were set up about 6 months ago, and this is probably the highest profile one so far. Yeah. So in January, after the storming of the Capitol, I'm sure everyone will remember there was those sort of knee-jerk reactions where Twitter and Facebook and other platforms turned around and said, we're now no longer going to allow Donald Trump to have a profile.
Yeah.
And the appeal process has meant this has come to the Facebook board. And initially, they've actually turned around and said, we don't agree with the ban that was put in place, because what was actually proposed by Facebook was indefinitely banning. So saying permanently you'll be off, and they said, well, that's not really consistent with Facebook's terms. So therefore, it's like, is he going to have that ban, and how long is it going to be in place for? What would be justifiable? What would be reasonable? I think we have to remember that, first of all, this is just Facebook looking at. So I mean, if anything, the big one for Trump, of course, was Twitter, where he had millions of followers and arguably spent 4 years running the United States via tweet in a way that no president before or since ever has or ever will. But really, Facebook was of secondary importance, but Facebook was a big tool for campaigning. So it was very heavily used by the Trump campaign to get those small donations in. Hundreds of thousands of little donations of a few dollars actually make a big difference now in US campaigning. It's no longer dominated by the big multinationals making their corporate donations in quite the way that it was, though of course those are still significant and important. But the point here then is that we have Facebook with this oversight board and the growing influence of Nick Clegg. That quote, "I defer to Nick," was said by Mark Zuckerberg in a Facebook board meeting. And given that Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg's fiefdom and empire, the fact that he's saying on issues like this he defers to Nick Clegg, I think is really quite telling in terms of the fact that Zuckerberg doesn't like being the public point man on this. He wants to be able to stand back and say, I'm the guy who set up Facebook, this is what I do, but he doesn't want to get involved on these particular high profile issues in terms of who's banned and for how long for. And Laura, I hate to say it, you're of the generation that won't remember this, I suspect, but Nick Clegg infamously became Prime Minister of the UK in 2010, and was Deputy Prime Minister until 2015. And in the election campaign in 2010, in the first debate between Gordon Brown, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, famously there was this line where both Gordon Brown and David Cameron were falling over themselves to say, I agree with Nick, because Nick Clegg was coming across as very calm and reasonable, and if anything, he won the first TV debate. So the fact that Zuckerberg said, I defer to Nick, for those of us of a certain age, is sort of echoing the dim and distant past when he was this incredibly, probably the most popular politician in the UK for about 10 days. Those days are long gone, and indeed, it's almost a blowback to a long gone era of centrist politicians all rushing to agree with each other. That seems a world away from where we are now in 2021, but there you go. Now we have I defer to you, Nick, as the new slogan from Mark Zuckerberg.
Thanks, Peter. I think you've summarised everything there. So moving on to our next story then. So this is sticking with Facebook. So this is in regards to the data breach that I think we spoke about last week, and we spoke about a couple of times on this podcast as well. So just as a recap for those who haven't heard about it. So last month it was actually reported that 533 million Facebook users accounts from over 100 countries had their phone numbers, their Facebook identification credentials, full names, locations, birth dates, and some email addresses uploaded onto a hacker's forum. And this is all caused by a simple security issue. One of the features to do with downloading contacts to your phones or something like that, something to do with sharing contacts. And this data breach actually presents a number of takeaways, and basically this article went into a lot of detail as to what we can take away from this breach and what companies and big organisations and that can learn from it. And I think the main thing that we always say is to always prepare for a breach, like it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen, but when. And this article kind of goes into the same thing, and it says the main being is being prepared. And being prepared for when on a when basis, not an if basis. And it basically goes into saying that you should plan for the following. So it's 5 points, and the first being who leads the response if a breach happens. Who's going to lead it? Is it going to be your DPO, your security team, your managing director? Are you aware that you need to notify the ICO within 72 hours of discovering the breach? So making sure that you know how to report the breach and you have that structure in place ready to go as soon as you gain knowledge of it. Number 3, do you need to talk to anyone else? Do you need to inform your insurers? Is there any other regulators? In what circumstances do you need to speak to your data subjects about it? Number 4, how easy is it to switch to your backup data? do you even have a backup system? We always recommend that you have a separate backup server, which is like completely separate to your main server. And the final one is, do you have cyber insurance, and what does this actually cover? So making sure that you actually know what this covers, so when it comes to the data breach, you know then if you need to speak to them about it and how you can use that insurance to basically build yourself back up as well.
Thanks, Laura. I think these 5 points are incredibly important when it comes to planning your response to a breach. As you quite rightly say, it's plan for the worst. And let's face it, I think it was last week we looked at some data where it said 95% of organisations in the last year have been on the end of a cyber attack of some shape or form. So I think you need to think, all organisations need to be thinking about, well, if we do have a breach, what do we do? I don't think anyone wants to be the person running around like a headless chicken when you get a data protection breach, wondering exactly what it is you should be doing. And I think the bigger the organisation, the more serious that response has to be. I was at a briefing from one cybersecurity organisation that goes into big organisations and helps them with responses, and they admitted that their model is actually based on what used to be the model when there were aircraft crash investigations. So they would literally have a room set up ready to go in an organisation with its own secure devices in there, so desktops, laptops on a separate network, separate power source, so that if there was a problem, a whole team could then switch into action and be ready to go. But I think the problem is making sure that also when you have a plan in place, you then test the thing regularly as well. I have heard of some organisations that have said, oh, we don't need to worry about these sorts of things, we have a plan, and then when they've actually tested that plan, you find it doesn't work because the key people named in there could have moved on to other positions. Some of the positions might have changed or been reorganised or subject to redundancy. So you sometimes find that what you thought was a brilliant cutting-edge Rolls-Royce plan actually needs to be regularly tested and modified. So I think these 5 points are an excellent starting point. So I think we'll just go through them again one by one. So what was that first point again there, Laura?
Yeah, so the first one was who leads the response. So whether that's your DPO, your security team, or just a specific member of staff, basically, who's going to lead that, or maybe a team of people as well.
Exactly. So indeed, it's making sure that it's nominated. You don't want a case of having too many chiefs who are all saying, well, no, I should be doing this or I should be doing that. By the same token, you don't want it to be a matter of finding that no one is willing to take any clear responsibility. You also don't want to find that, for example, if you've got a data protection officer and that it's they're responsible, but they're on leave, what happens then? You don't want it to be the case that, oh, we've had a data protection breach, but our data protection officer appears to be in the pub on a Friday evening. You need to make sure you've got those sort of other plans in place to pick up. So is it going to be a security team? Do you pick up the phone to an external specialist? You know, who is going to lead this for you? It sounds obvious, but it's actually a really important decision to have that proper chain of command there, so that you know if the worst happens, you can immediately go to the responsible individual or responsible team that will end up leading on this. And I think that the next reason for that is, of course, that timeline, which we have at point 2. Do you want to just read out point 2 again for us there, please?
Yeah, so that's, are you aware that you need to notify the ICO within 72 hours of discovering the breach, and how do you actually report it?
Exactly. So we've got this 72 hours, and bearing in mind that's 72 hours from when you discover the breach, the date of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a matter of just picking up the phone and saying to the ICO, hello, we've had a breach, we'll come back to you in 4 months and tell you how bad it was. The ICO will want to know what data has been affected, what systems are compromised, how big is the breach, what sort of data are we looking at? Is it just, are we looking at, say, you've lost a couple of thousand email addresses, or is it people's payment card information? Heaven forfend, it could be things like, say, someone's criminal records or medical record data, some really sensitive stuff. So the ICO is going to know, well, what are we looking at? And they're also going to want to know, well, what are you doing about it? What are you doing to stem the bleeding? Is this attack still ongoing? Is it a vulnerability that you've rectified? Do you need to put out an update? They'll want to know all that sort of information at the point that you notify them. And if you can't confirm all that information, they'll want to know when you will be in a position to confirm it. So the more information you can give to the ICO from the off, the less likely they'll then be concerned and feel that they need to watch your investigation and indeed open their own investigation and potentially lead to a monetary penalty notice. So that 72 hours, that 72-hour window you've got to investigate is incredibly important, which means you can't waste a single one of those hours on point one, working out who's leading your response. So let's go on to point three there, shall we?
Yeah, so point three is who you need to talk to. So whether that's insurers, regulators, data subjects, or any other people who've been affected.
Exactly, and that could even include your internal comms. So, you know, are you going to tell all of your staff? Are you just going to tell your heads of department or certain key people? Are you going to inform your board? If you're a publicly traded company, do you have to tell the markets? If so, how and when? Insurers, you could have multiple insurance policies that you need to call on, everything from professional indemnity through to employee liability or employer's liability, sorry. Or indeed specialist cyber cover, and we'll come to that, but also regulators. And that could be not just the ICO. I mean, if you are in the medical industry or medicine, then it could be the General Medical Council. Are you in accounting? Are you regulated in the financial services industry? You might find that you've got a plethora of regulators, depending on what your organization carries out, that you have to notify, as well as the ICO. And that's before you then think, do we tell the affected data subjects? And if you've got a few thousand affected data subjects, that will not be the work of a moment. So having worked out that list of who you need to talk to, and also putting it in order, bearing in mind that if you've got a breach as a result of a cyber attack or a break-in, top of that list is going to be the police, most likely.
Yeah, definitely.
And then point four there, Laura.
Yeah, so the fourth one is, how easy is it for you to switch your backup data? And do you even have a backup that is separate from your main server?
Exactly. So then we come to, look, is the backup in place? Has it been tested? Is it actually backing up all of your system or part of it? And we always recommend, look, either do a regular full system reset or part system reset just to test that your backup is working. But again, you don't want to be scratching around trying to work out the answer to this question after the event. So make sure you've got a good backup. Make sure you actually know what it is backing up. Because if, for example, your entire system's dead, but your backup only, for example, contains all of the client data, well, are you going to be able to, for example, restore all of your key emails? Are you going to be able to restore key sources of information, databases that you rely on? So I think it's really important to define what you've got in that backup. And sometimes the word backup is used as a catch-all, when in fact it isn't. So I think it's a question that's really important to know definitively what's being backed up, how and when, basically. It's really quite key. And then that takes us to our last point.
Yeah, so the last point is, do you have cyber insurance, and what does this actually cover?
Indeed, the multi-million-dollar question. So have you got a cyber policy? And then work out from the policy wording what's actually covered. And be careful, because just because a policy says cyber liability on the front doesn't mean it's going to cover all of the things you might think that it covers. So will it cover you for regulatory investigation by the ICO? Will it cover you for a regulatory investigation by another regulator, one of the ones that we just talked about? What about if you get claims from affected data subjects, if they are employees or contacts or staff or customers? Will it cover you for a class action? If there is a class action, will it cover you for making awards to those claimants? Would it cover the costs of the claimants' legal representatives? Would it cover your court fees in the event of a class action? Would it cover you if your business has loss of turnover as a result of a breach? You know, if your turnover halves over the course of the year, are you entitled to claim that back? So I think it's really important to actually check what is in there, because I think an awful lot of organizations think, oh great, we're covered for us for any cyber breach. Look, it's covered in this cyber policy. But I've seen cyber liability policies, and some of them are 5 pages long and some of them are 50 pages long, and they have wildly different levels of cover in them. So it's actually, there are specialist insurance lawyers out there, and if you are an organization investing in one of these policies, you might want to invest in a few hours of a lawyer's time to read through that and definitively give you the answer on exactly what's covered in here, and crucially, what's the claim process how long will it take for me to get my money back? You know, if you've had a serious breach and you're thinking, we're going to need a significant claim here to help us through the next couple of months while we investigate and deal with this, that's not going to help you if the average claim time is going to take 6 months or a year, and even then they're not going to pay out for the things you think it will. So I think that bit of due diligence at the start will really help you further down the road. And cyber insurance is often overlooked. So I think that's why it's so important to have this on one of these 5 key points. I think they're very good 5 points as a result.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Peter. So I think that's everything covered on that one. So moving on to the next story then, but kind of staying in the same data breach. So this is just a quick story that I came across, and it's in regards to an embarrassing data breach for Solicitor General. So this is a Solicitor General of the Philippines, and basically 300,000 data files, some of which contain sensitive information belonging to the Office of the Solicitor General of the Philippines, were accessed by an unknown party. While the scope of this looks quite shocking, I think the story behind it is actually quite interesting of how it was done. So this was simply done by not carried out by any advanced technique. It was just a malicious actor took advantage of a simple and well-documented misconfiguration, which was they basically gained access to this by a public-facing database, meaning that anybody who actually had internet access could have just gone on to this database and just gained access to the system. So I think it's just basically making people aware that data breaches can happen so easily, and just making sure that you have everything in place, like your databases are encrypted to make sure things like this don't happen.
Indeed, thanks, Laura, and thank you for your research on digging this one out. You know, I hope none of our listeners think that we focus too much on the UK. I think this is a brilliant example of what unfortunately can go wrong. And I mean, it's the size of this, but I think almost the most scary bit is the bit at the end of your summary there, actually, where it's the fact that they didn't even find out about the breach until the researcher found the data. So they don't even know how and when this breach really happened, or how long some third party had access to it. They could still have access to it. You know, we could have been talking about a system being vulnerable and someone else having access to it for months or years here, and it would never have been found out were it not for the fact that researcher then found the data, and the fact that it had been leaked online. And it was such a straightforward, obvious misconfiguration. And I think the point is that when these things are well documented, very often updates have been provided, but sometimes, just for whatever reason, organizations don't put those updates in place on either their hardware or even on hardware like routers and servers. And that just opens up these sorts of misconfigurations that can then be taken advantage of. And yeah, it's particularly embarrassing when it is the Office of the Solicitor General, which will be, of course, handling all of the really sensitive information relating to the government. So anything from, you know, prosecutions to investigations across a whole range of departments. So really sensitive data there for the Philippines government that has just been freely available online. So incredibly embarrassing for them. But the thing is, they found out about it, learn from it, make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to add this one in because I thought it was just interesting how easy these things can be done. So it just kind of brings it back. I know, like a lot of people, we've spoken about this a lot of times before, but we always think that these big cyber attacks, when 300,000 files are stolen with a lot of sensitive information in, are carried out in such a complex way. But it is just sometimes that simple.
Exactly, so, absolutely.
No worries. So moving on to our next story then. So this is from the NCSC, so the National Cyber Security Centre, and they've been doing weekly reports for a while now. I actually just stumbled across these. So basically, I think each week they put two or three stories together about some of the threats for that week, and they put them into a quick little report. So in this week's, so the 30th of April, so it was actually last week, but it's the latest one they've done. One of the threats was to do with hackers threatening to leak confidential US police data. So basically, the Washington DC's Metropolitan Police Department had reportedly had its network breached in a targeted attack. The attackers posted a ransom note which claimed that they had stolen 258 gigabytes of data and threatening to publish this material if they were not paid. So basically, the NCSC was just bringing attention to this and basically just saying that they've got some guidance on mitigating the effect of a malware and ransomware attack and protecting bulk personal data. And they've also published some guidance on how the public can protect themselves against the impact of data breaches in the event of personal data being involved. And the second one that was mentioned here as well was to do with hedge funds. So fraudsters are investing significant amounts of time and effort into elaborate scams targeting hedge funds at the minute. So financial services are 300 times more likely than other companies to be targeted by a cyber attack. And the trends show that it's smaller financial services firms that are more likely to be the target, because smaller firms don't tend to be investing that much money into things like this. So just to be aware of that as well. And the NCSC have published guidance on phishing and how to deal with suspicious emails, phone calls and text messages. And they've also published some more guidance on how organisations can protect themselves against phishing as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Laura, for you're digging into this and finding these examples from the NCSC. So that first one with regards to the US police data, I think, is concerning, and we're talking about the Washington DC Metropolitan Police. So while this isn't, of course, the Capitol Police who ended up defending the Capitol when there were those very unfortunate attacks in January, this is still the police force defending the capital of the United States of America. And there's going to be, they are investigating, they are keeping safe the region where the United States elite work. And therefore it's a real concern when they fall victim to what appears to be straightforward ransomware.
Yeah.
And it's great to see the FBI is investigating it, but the fact that their system was compromised in this way, I think, is really quite concerning, and a lesson in the fact that they will be bound to have taken precautions with their data, and yet still they've been compromised in this way. So it's showing that just because you might have what you think are appropriate organizational and technical measures in place, these constantly need to be evolved and updated. You cannot ever relax, unfortunately. And the more sensitive the data you have, the more you have to be alive to it. And then that takes us to that second point on the hedge funds. The reason, why are financial services 300 times more likely to be targeted? Well, let's face it, if you are going to carry out an attack on an organization, your chances if you attack a financial services organization of then getting command and control of large sums of money is going to be an awful lot higher if you attack financial services compared to if you go after a organization in more, say, straightforward retail. So therefore, it means that the return for your investment of time on carrying out your cyber attack can be so much greater. And that example that you've got there, it talks about specifically, scammers impersonating different parties on transactions involving hedge funds. And of course, the rewards for that sort of scam could be running into the millions of pounds very, very easily. So I think this is a bit of a wake-up call for financial services to say, even if you are a small-scale financial services house engaged in hedge funds, you still need to, I think, be investing in significant technical measures to try and keep your network safe, in particular when you're going to have had your staff working from home for a large part over the course of the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads us perfectly on to our last story in regards to working from home and Wi-Fi routers. So this
You
is
say
something.
that, Laura. You say that, Laura, almost like we planned it.
Exactly. So this is something we've been speaking about for well, we've spoke about this before the pandemic even came and more people started working from home. Even when we were carrying out GDPR assessments before the pandemic, just on how people work in general, this was always something that came up in conversations and questions we always asked about. But especially since people have been working from home, we spoke about routers more often and like Wi-Fi and how, if they're split into different things, how they're updated and everything like that. So this story came out on the BBC News and basically saying that millions of people could actually be using outdated routers that basically putting themselves at risk of being hacked. And obviously when more and more people are working from home nowadays, this just makes it more, the hack would be obviously a bit more beneficial for those hacking because people are not working in the office, they're working from home, usually on your home Wi-Fi. It's just made for watching some Netflix or doing some online shopping or something. But with a lot of people working from home, they're being used a lot more. So the consumer watchdog, which actually examined 13 models provided to customers by internet service providers such as EE, Sky and Virgin Media, and they found that 2/3 of these routers had flaws. So it's estimated that 6 million people have a device that hasn't been updated since 2018 or even earlier. And in some cases, they would have received crucial security updates, would not have received crucial security updates. So some of the problems found when they were carrying out these tests in the labs was weak default passwords, cyber criminals could hack, were found to be on most routers, a lack of firmware updates, which is important for security and performance, as well as network vulnerabilities with a brand in particular, the EE's Brightbox 2, which could give the hacker the full control of the device that is being used on that router.
Thanks, Laura. Indeed. Unfortunately, the chickens are now coming home to roost, aren't they? Because we've been talking about these vulnerabilities, as you say, several times over the course of Windows updates. This is a thing we've known was coming. Sure enough, we're finding out that these home networks are simply not up to the job. And certainly they are now being used far more heavily, probably, than an awful lot of these providers originally intended. So, you know, when a network is just set up, as you said, for just, you know, Netflix and perhaps a bit of home gaming with an Xbox, the fact is that now we've had staff working at home, using the networks all day, using them for everything from checking email to doing endless meetings on Teams and Zoom. And at the same time, we've got our homes becoming increasingly more sophisticated. So, you know, we've got our home devices, everything from online thermostats through to the lights and the fridge, and you can even get, Laura, a Wi-Fi enabled toothbrush. Why you should want to have your toothbrush Wi-Fi enabled beats me. I presume it's so you can look at an app and it tells you how clean your teeth are after you've been using the toothbrush for 3 minutes. I mean, you know, if you want that and then data and bar charts on it, that's great. But of course, everything that is enabled as smart adds to the vulnerability on the network. I read earlier this week about apparently one hotel in Las Vegas, big casino, loads of transactions. So you've got people betting and of course staying in the hotel, and as well as then people betting online, and all that's being administered through the hotel. How did the hackers get onto that network with all of that high value payment information? They hacked the pump, the water pump on the fish tank in the hotel reception area. So that just shows that sometimes having something that's IoT enabled on your network just creates a vulnerability. And then you then see with these home networks that the routers themselves are a source of that vulnerability. So anyone who's used, very often at home you either get the installer comes out and fits it, or they send a router to you in the post with some instructions that you follow, and very often they've got default passwords set on there that can be easily hacked, as Which is saying here, or they aren't receiving the regular updates that they need. And there's various reasons why sometimes a provider might not provide the update. It might be that the performance of the network would suffer, so they don't want to put out the update, but then that means that there's a vulnerability on there that could be exploited. So really, I think this is a wake-up call to organizations to say, okay, if you're going to continue with large-scale work from home, I think we will. I think people, employees now want to be able to work from home, and I think the days of the Monday to Friday 9 till 5 commute are dead and buried, and long live that state of affairs. I hasten to add, but I think now it's a matter of thinking, if you're going to have staff working from home, actually consider either getting additional broadband for them, or investing in better broadband, and making sure that perhaps they aren't using just the home device system that they've got. Give them help on getting a better router, either buy a lot of modern up-to-date routers, get those installed that can partition the network, so that, for example, you can have your devices on one network at home and your work devices on another, and then perhaps the third guest network, which you then provide to any guests that come round. Let's face it, if you've got a big family, lots of teenage children, you've got no idea when they walk through the door and ask for the Wi-Fi password who these people are. They could be far more proficient on using this technology than you are, and they could be getting onto your devices and your work equipment for all you know. So I think this is an ideal time, which I think is bang on the money here, releasing this report right now. It's a wake-up call to organizations to say, now it's 2021, touch wood, pandemic is winding down, certainly in the UK, and we now need to work on reducing our vulnerability created by having staff working from home, and reduce that risk and minimize the chance of the worst possible thing happening with the cyber breach. So an excellent, well-timed report, and let's now use it for the purpose it's intended. Make sure that we now start to minimize these risks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's everything we have time for today. So thank you once again to our listeners for listening. For just those who are new here, we just want to remind you of our GDPR compliance manual for legal practices. So this is down from £195 to £99, so around 50% off. And is available in both hard copy and digital copy as well. So I'll just pass over to Peter just to give you a little bit more information about it.
Yes, so this is our GDPR compliance manual for law firms, which contains all the forms and templates and checklists to help you with your compliance when it comes to data protection. So we take the sometimes difficult and rather confusing law and put it into straightforward, understandable language, and give you practical, usable tools to help you with being able to comply and demonstrate compliance with the law. So the guide's there. It works for law firms and also for other organisations in highly regulated sectors like accounting and medicine and education as well. We are working on other versions, but there's some useful tools and models in there that I think will really help people if they need to get a handle on their GDPR compliance.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder as well, and a big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us produce this webinar. So for those who don't know, Anson Evaluate are a consultancy business, and they provide training, webinars and consultancy services. So I have put their website on the screen, which is ansonevaluate.com, and their email address, which is admin@ansonevaluate.com as well. For any of those who are interested in getting any training, if you want a webinar produced or even a podcast, they can help you with that as well.
Yes, and there's also some brilliant posts on the Anson Evaluate site this week with regards to the enforcement by the ICO on organisations engaged in marketing. So where enforcement's been carried out due to spam texts and emails. There is another post on there with regards to credit reference agencies and how they've been carrying out shadow processing and the enforcement they're facing, and there'll also be a post with regards to driverless cars if you're interested in that. So take a look at the Anson Evaluate site.
Great, thanks, Peter. So thank you to everyone once again for listening, and we will be back next week for another episode. So just a reminder, this webinar is available on demand as well, and it is available on podcast channels and through our website and YouTube. So thank you once again for listening, and we hope to see you next week.